Hello and welcome to the Real News Network. I'm your host, Aman Azhar. And my guest today is Professor David Orr, author of several books. I think I'll leave some of the introductions to him. Professor Orr, thank you for taking out time and talking to us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate the chance to be on Real News.
So let me fire away by asking, what does the US elections this time around mean for the global climate movement and solidarity? I mean, Biden says that he will rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, but it seems more like a symbolic gesture to me.
Well, I think the election itself is a major event in world politics. I don't think if President Trump is reelected, he describes climate change as a hoax. He has been a very inconsistent presence on the world stage. It's not clear what exactly his policy is. I'll leave it to others who study him more carefully than I do, but I don't think he has firm convictions about much of anything. And the role of Russia in his presidency has always been a bit mysterious. We've never seen his tax returns and so forth. So there's a good bit that we don't know about what makes President Trump work. But what we do know is climate change is not on his agenda. His administration has systematically removed people who understand the policy and the options. He ran, there's something about Obama. Whatever Obama was for, he was going to be against. So in terms of evolving climate policy, I think it will not happen under Trump. We'll waste another 4 years as a country. Our carbon emissions are down maybe 10 or 12%, but that's because of the economic turndown and the pandemic. If Biden's elected, I think it's a whole very different scenario. I think Biden does get the importance of the issue. I think he's surrounded himself with a lot of people, other Democratic candidates, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and so forth, and climate activists like Bill McKibben. He is talking to a lot of the right people. And the point here is the larger point, going to 35,000 feet, is that we don't have much time before we pass a point of no return. So it's for the viewers, it's a little bit like going down a superhighway. We're passing exit ramps to better destinations than what is dead ahead. So at 1.5 degrees centigrade warming, I think quite literally almost all bets are off, certainly at 2 degrees centigrade warming. But all the warning signs, if this was a cockpit of an airplane, there would be warning signs flashing all the way across the cockpit. Our speed's all wrong, our altitude's all wrong, our direction's all wrong as a world. And if the United States is to lead, I think our last real chance for leadership is in a Biden presidency. And even there, the sense of urgency, the kind of, pardon the pun, but the voltage in the line, so to speak, has got to be very high. We've got to move very quickly and begin to galvanize a global response to the issue.
Right. And David, could you expand a little bit about what does these two scenarios in terms of elections mean for the global South, the developing countries?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a complicated subject, as you know. And I think at one side, let me just mention two parts of it. At one side of this is a moral issue. If you look at the amount of carbon the global North has put into the atmosphere, the United States, one of the largest, we bear a burden of having left this legacy of climate change go for so long. So that it's a moral issue. Who did the most to harm the global climate? Well, it was the industrialized North. The other thing I would say is that given the development of technology, which has been very rapid, the global South should not replicate the infrastructure of the electric grid or nuclear power plants or coal burning plants. We know enough that the combination of advanced efficiency, now technically possible, economically feasible, and renewable energy, whether it's biomass or solar photovoltaics or wind power, can make up the difference. So to put together entirely different energy scenarios. So that means that aid organizations, UN and private organizations and private foundations, should be spending money and helping to invest in that new infrastructure. I think it would be a profitable investments, but it should not replicate what we did in building the largest machine on the planet is the electric grid. And there's no necessity. It's simply an expense that doesn't have to be incurred. And combustion should not be part of that energy future. This should be a future driven by wind power, solar electricity, and then advanced efficiency. And I mentioned a third thing, and that is simply better design, where you're eliminating a good bit of the need to have energy because you've designed a society where things are proximate. Housing is proximate to employment and shopping. You build more densely designed cities and better designed cities.
Right. And could you say if under the Biden presidency, if that happens, how could United States specifically help the developing countries to combat the threats from climate change and global warming?
Well, I think there are a number of things, starting with U.S. leadership on its own case. I mean, the United States has got to take very seriously a climate policy for our own sake, but for the world itself. And I think U.S. leadership is an important part of this. It's been absent for the past 4 years. It took President Obama into his second administration before he got actively involved in the issue. But U.S. leadership is one thing. And then the second thing is technology transfers and the means to move technology worldwide. The third thing is financing of renewable energy systems. And these ought to be, whether in the United States or third world, ought to be employment positive. They ought to be good investments. They ought to make money, put people to work. So the idea here is to take the climate challenge, which appears to be an overwhelming challenge, and use our response to solve multiple problems. And one of the problems I think that we solve most evidently is to eliminate oil and the power of extractive economies that have been the source of terrorism and lots of anti-democratic thinking and stifling progressive movements around the world. So it upends global politics in lots of ways. The United States ought to be prepared to support that revolution that will be driven by the fact that oil simply isn't valuable anymore. You leave it in the ground, there's no market for it.
And does it really matter to have United States as a partner in the struggle against climate change, this emerging threat, which is pretty much here?
Yes, it does. And I think it matters in a number of ways, starting with justice. Climate change is, yes, it's a global environmental issue, but it's also an economic issue. But at the core, it's a justice issue. It's what kind of world do we build and where do people fit in that world? And also, what do we leave behind for future generations? So this is a justice issue. And I think one of the arguments we've been making in the State of American Democracy Project is that democracies are best equipped to handle those issues of justice. Do they do it all the time? No. But we're a new democracy is really democracy for the first time that is inclusive of all people, including future generations. And so that liberal democratic legacy and the laws that are built into that are pregnant with possibilities for redoing and making a world that is more just. That sounds strangely idealistic. But I think our reality of our situation is that we're at this opportune moment where the right thing to do in terms of justice and fairness is the smart thing to do in terms of politics and economics. And that convergence point, it doesn't happen often, but I think it certainly does now. The transition from a world run by fossil fuels and combustion that's caused so much damage to the planet and so much damage to people's lives and futures. Every country that is part of that extractive network, whether it's oil from Ecuador and Peru or the Middle East or wherever, has suffered. And extraction of those minerals has almost always gone hand in hand with authoritarianism, autocracy, and a lot of injustice.
And I can't help but asking, what would it take to do this kind of an institutional rebuilding for a country like the United States to factor in the kind of a needs for climate and environmental justice that you were talking about? What kind of a political will needs to be there?
Well, 3 comments back. One is I think the political will is there. If you look at public opinion poll data and the United States and even worldwide and ask people, do you want a world where the climate is changing rapidly and in parts of the Middle East it will be uninhabitable in a matter of decades? And the answer comes back, no. Do you want clean air? Yes. Water? Yes. Vibrant oceans, wildlife, abundance, and so forth. Public opinion is there. The second thing is to get to that point where you take the cork out of the bottle, quite literally. The thing stopping change is this oligarchy, and you can put, as you know better than I do, you can put 8 global billionaires in a golf cart. They would have more money in an 8-person golf cart than half or 2/3 of the entire rest of the world population. You can't have progressive change with money so tightly controlled. So there's got to be some effort to create equity and fairness in terms of the way economies work. But I think the issues are so profoundly important, and I think we've made progress in getting a lot of this information out. But if I change the metaphor to, let's say, a chasm, and on one side of the chasm you have public opinion that is strongly in favor of progressive changes, and on the other side of the chasm you have the laws and rules and regulations that we live by. The bridge that ought to connect one side to the other has been rendered into a toll bridge. You have to have money to influence all of those policies and regulations. So what's happened is a good bit of public opinion has simply been steamrollered by what amounts to effectively an oligarchy.
And I think the final hurdle would be this continuing climate denialism in a country like the United States. What are we going to do about that?
Well, there is still in London, I'm told, an office where the Flat Earth Society maintains its professional, work. And climate denial is the least of my worries. In the United States, poll data again show that 60-70% of the public, Republicans and Democrats alike, understand the problem. And it will be driven by the hard realities of sea level rise, bigger storms, fires that burn out of control, the 5 million acres that have burned on the West Coast. People will get the point. And I think the other side of this is, I think people will get the point once an effective renewable energy policy is in place. They'll understand, because this is millions of good jobs that will be permanent jobs. It's restoring land, restoring hills in West Virginia. It's going to be a major source of employment and a new source of wealth. There's work to be done. And the time to get the work done is very short. And so we've got to be about that work and that sense of urgency. I think, Aman, the last thing I'd say is this. Climate denialism thrives only because some parts of the leadership refuse to accept the scientific reality. I don't want to pick on Donald Trump, but he refused science on the current pandemic. He's refused to face science on climate change. But that position can't hold for long. Sooner or later, reality will break through. And I think it has for most people. But the reality is two-sided. It is that the situation is dangerous. There is real peril here. But there's also the promise of a much better world powered by sunshine and efficiency that's much more equitable and fair and decent. And that's the side that I think we all need to be on. I hope that's the thing that's at stake. One of the things that's at stake in this election.
Well, on this note of optimism, let me also bring a close to this conversation. Professor Orr, thank you so much once again for taking out time and speaking with us today on this important subject.
Aman, thank you. Have a good day.
And thanks also to our audiences for tuning in. You can always look us up at therealnews.com. For myself and the rest of the team at The Real News, it's goodbye and be well.